Greetings, this is Mike Billington with the Schiller Institute, the LaRouche organization, and the Executive Intelligence Review. I'm pleased to be here with Dr. Richard Sakwa, who is a professor of Russian and European Studies at the School of Politics and International Relations at the University of Kent in the UK. He has served as head of that school twice in the past. He's also a senior research fellow at the National Research Institute, the Higher School of Economics in Moscow, and honorary professor in the Faculty of Political Science at Moscow State University. He's an author of dozens of books and many, many articles, and is a very active participant in both political and academic fora, and a highly respected spokesman for global cooperation as the only means to prevent war. So greetings, Professor Sakwa. I'm delighted that you agreed to do an interview. On the day we scheduled this interview earlier this week, Vladimir Putin announced that Russia would recognize the independence of the Donetsk and Luhansk republics, and then subsequently attacked military sites across Ukraine and moved some ground forces into the country. President Putin said the objective is to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. You've studied and written about Russia for decades. How do you see Putin's move, and how do you expect things will develop going forward?
Well, it's a great pleasure to be with you today. And obviously, we're meeting at a time of, how can I put it, a global turning point in all sorts of ways, even though it's a culmination of processes which have been going on for a long time. So the Ukrainian crisis at the moment is, the war is the intersection of all sorts of trends. The big one, obviously, is the failure of achieving a unified, indivisible post-Cold War order, the focusing obviously on NATO enlargement, but much more than that, about the failure to establish some sort of overarching framework for security. And the sharp point of all of this, of course, is Ukraine, and it came to a head in 2014, as we all know, and then with the Lugansk and Donetsk People's Republics, where we've had nearly 4 million people living effectively under siege. So when you ask, why has Putin acted at this time? We had, of course, a Normandy format, which has been going on, an attempt to implement the Minsk Accords, which was a way of restoring Donetsk and Lugansk to Ukrainian sovereignty. This failed. It failed under President Poroshenko from 2014 to 2019, and then Vladimir Zelensky since then. And we've also, that's of course nested within the larger question to get an overarching European security order. So there's at least 3 levels of conflict: the one in the Donbass, one over Ukraine more broadly, its neutrality or future place in a security order, and then the larger failure of European security. You could even add a 4th, which is that global tension, pressure between the United States' vision as a global hegemon and the resistance of powers like Russia and China to those hegemonic ambitions. So we're living at the intersection of multiple crises, and it's not quite clear that if we end up with this crisis escalating to the top level, we're really talking about a global war.
How do you see the Russian people responding to this situation?
It's extremely mixed. I think that everybody's shocked. No one really expected this. They just like Ukrainian people. And it's a strange sort of conflict, one which was endlessly anticipated, yet when it happened, extremely unexpected. We've seen some protests across Russia. We've seen leading political figures condemning it. At the same time, the elite seems to be relatively united on the view that the Ukrainian developments moving into NATO, and possibly even what was most shocking was President Zelensky's comment at the Munich Security Forum that Ukraine may become a nuclear weapons power. That was shocking enough. But what was perhaps even more disturbing was the lack of response of the Western powers, the Atlantic powers, which of course are blocking North Korea and Iran becoming nuclear weapon powers. And yet it seemed as if Ukraine was going to be given a free pass. And technically, as Putin pointed out, and not just him, it wouldn't be so hard with experts in Ukraine to go that way. So this is not to justify anything which has happened, but certainly it's the perception amongst a section of the elite was that Russia faced an existential challenge.
Elizabeth Wilmshurst, who's a leading fellow at Chatham House, which is the British Empire's preeminent think tank, accused Russia of, and this is a quote from her article, violating the prohibition in the UN Charter on the use of force, violating the obligation to respect sovereignty and territorial integrity of other states, and violating the prohibition on intervention, and then went on to lecture Russia on the meaning of international law. I find this rather rich coming from a country that invaded and destroyed several Mideast nations, which were no threat to anyone, killing and wounding millions and driving millions more from their homes. Perhaps you could comment on this hypocrisy.
Well, it's yet again another indication of the crisis of the post-Cold War order. We never really had a stable, unified peace order at that fourth level I mentioned, at the global level. Of course, double standards really are the name of the game, and they have been for a long time. Obviously, when NATO is being talked about as a peace body, a collective defense body only, we've seen the bombing of Serbia in 1999, not so much a NATO plan of invasion of Iraq in 2003, and above all, the destruction of the Libyan state in 2011, which was all very disturbing. But the Libyan was particularly interesting, affecting for me, and that was because in 2008, Libya and Italy signed a developmental agreement, a long-term cooperation agreement. Italy, of course, is the former colonial power. And this really did seem to be the way forwards. Gaddafi, of course, had given up ambitions to become a nuclear power in the early 2000s. And as part of this shift away from the old Gaddafi system of rule, his son, Saif al-Islam, was leading a reform effort and was funding PhD students across the world. One of them came to Kent, and I was working with him. And it was fascinating to gather every few weeks. He would go back to Libya. His family was there, and he would meet up with Saif al-Islam. And it was genuine feeling that this is between 2008 and 2011, that, just before the events, that Libya was going to change. It was going to be gradual and move in a way we'd all want towards a greater freedom, respect for the dignity in different ways, but dignity of the citizens and so on, while maintaining and keeping the developments which had happened in the Gaddafi years. All of that was destroyed in 2011. So it really is a shocking evidence, a moment. And of course, all of the falsehoods which attended the attack. The resolution 1973 was limited to limited no-fly zone and so on, instead of which it was taken far beyond it. Of course, one element doesn't justify another, but certainly that's why we all argue, certainly I do, against militarism on all sides, in that we need to have a genuine strategy for peace and development.
You have written 4 books on Vladimir Putin himself, and I'm certain you watched his extraordinary speech Monday night and subsequent speeches on the history of the Ukraine issue, and announcing the recognition of the 2 republics, and then announcing why he was carrying out military action. Could you give us your sense of the man and your expectation of his role in the future?
It's in the light of these events of the invasion of Ukraine, there's been much speculation in the British media that he's in somehow, some way, mentally unhinged or unstable or suffering from late-stage despot syndrome. I don't see that. This is not to justify what's going on, but I certainly don't see that. His speech on the 21st of February about Ukrainian history was meandering, but it was, the underlying it was a controlled passion or not desperation even, but anger about the fact that Ukraine has become his, and may become, indeed, we don't know how this is going to end, his nemesis. But the arguments he made were rational. Whether they were right or not is a question we can all debate, but they were certainly rational that Ukraine, despite what people have said, the speech did not say that Ukraine has no right to sovereign statehood. In fact, he just simply said, you have a responsibility as a sovereign state to look after all of your people within that sovereign state, and at the same time to ensure peace and development by working with your neighbors. And the desperation in his tone was because Ukraine failed to do that. Elite failed to do it in one form or another. And that's one reason why, in the very last moments, he refused even to talk to Zelensky and others, because there was just absolutely a movement really happening to achieve, or even to accept, the legitimacy of Russia's security concerns, let alone their substance.
Natalia Vitrenko, who's a long-term friend of the Schiller Institute and the LaRouches, is the chairwoman of the Progressive Socialist Party of Ukraine. And she spoke at a Schiller Institute conference just last week on February 19th. She presented a devastating picture of the collapse of the Ukrainian economy and the influence of the neo-Nazis within the government and the institutions of Ukraine since the 2014 coup. Putin also addressed the internal breakdown of key industries of the economy and the social structure in his Monday speech. This contrasts, of course, greatly with the Western media argument that the US and NATO are defending freedom and democracy in Ukraine against Russian autocracy. You've written about Ukraine for many years. You have a quite famous book on Ukraine. What was the internal situation there as this Russian action began?
I think Natalia Vitrenko's analysis is one of the best, and others perhaps in the left tradition. Vladimir Ishchenko, another one, because they've understood the way that the model of post-communist capitalism, and then the way that it has developed in 2014, which has unleashed a neoliberal shock therapy on a society which has already been devastated and pillaged by inequality and indeed by political intolerance. We know that the Communist Party was banned in 2014, rather shocking development. The Socialist Party, or so the group which Natalia leads, has been under permanent pressure. And of course, the Ukraine is one of the few states which is its GDP, both in nominal terms and per capita terms, today is lower than it was in 1991. A shocking development, and indeed, whole swathes of industry have died back, and the reflection of this dire economic circumstances with very, very expensive services, energy and so on, all pushed by the IMF, has been mass immigration. At least 6 million have gone as labor immigrants. And it's interesting that as the events developing this week, there's been endless talk of 44 million Ukrainians, which perhaps is indeed the case, but not within Ukraine. The population has fallen from 48 million at independence to estimated now lower than 40 million living, or before the events, living in Ukraine itself. So it's a catastrophic position. And worse of all is that political atmosphere of these mobilized civil society militant groupings, which have effectively kept the society and politics hostage for many years, certainly since 2014.
In the 2019 presidential election in Ukraine, Vladimir Zelensky was portrayed by many as a peace candidate who wanted to make peace with the Donbass and with Russia, and he won a landslide election. Was that characterization accurate? And if so, what happened to that impulse? Because it's certainly not there, doesn't appear to be there today.
He certainly did present himself as the peace candidate, just like, by the way, Poroshenko did in the election of May 2014. He was putting himself forward, and the people believed him, as an oligarch and somebody with economic interests in Russia. Because my profound belief, until recently, was that both Russian people and Ukrainian people wanted peace, genuinely, profoundly, because they are, in effect, one people, not one state, one, very many links. But it was, so Poroshenko immediately betrayed that peace mandate. And Zelensky actually did try. He was elected in April 2019 with over 70% of the vote, an overwhelming landslide, because he did say and promise peace, which was very good. However, in the early years, then he did try to implement it, in particular, the meeting of the Normandy format in December 2019, when Macron, Merkel, Putin, and Zelensky met in Paris. This was a very important meeting, and it really did seem as if the Donbass question could be resolved. So he did make an effort. However, even as they were meeting, these four were meeting, the militants were gathering on the Maidan and threatening Zelensky and say, even with a coup. And Zelensky did follow up. His chief of staff did have some meetings, but all of that very quickly ran into the sands because effectively the elected leader of Ukraine did not dare to stand up to the militants. And so this was, in part, one of the reasons for the frustration of the Kremlin leadership in the time since, in 2020 and 21. And of course, with the arming of this force also then became even more. Once the failure of the peace movements, failure of implementation of Minsk, and then increasing arming of Ukraine and training. The British, of course, in the forefront of this with a major naval modernization contract, and including modernization of the port not far from Odessa. So it seemed as if time was running out for, peace was no longer on the agenda, and worse than that, a more militant and more aggressive Ukraine was beginning to emerge.
So it sounds like it would be fair to say that the government in Ukraine is not run by Zelensky and his official government as much as by the neo-Nazi gangs.
Well, I wouldn't go so far as to say that, because they're still the government. The economic bloc continues, the financial bloc, of course. Much of it very much interpenetrated by officials from the US Embassy and other external organizations. So it's a balance. Ukraine has always been a very diverse and plural and, genuinely democratic society in certain respects with certain limits. But there's a fundamental sense of, dynamic pluralism in that society. Unfortunately, it's too often, as you're suggesting, and I agree with that the actual formal mechanisms are eroded not only by corruption, but by these informal pressure lobbies, which have had an extraordinarily deleterious influence on the political development. And unfortunately, Zelensky was not able to stand up to them and thus became hostage to them.
Zelensky today said that I think the way he put it was, I am not afraid to meet with Russia, with Putin, to discuss security guarantees, to discuss neutrality for Ukraine, the very things that they refused to do earlier. Do you see any chance that, in fact, Russia will negotiate and not demand regime change through this process?
If only he'd said that a week ago. And if only that endless diplomacy, when we had Macron going to Moscow, we had Scholz going to Moscow, which I laud them, I support them. Any attempt to try to maintain a peaceful development is to be applauded. But we seem to be in a total impasse where we had endless talks, but they were sterile. There was no substance to it. So what Zelensky is now saying, guarantees of neutrality and mutual security, this has been exactly what Russia has been arguing for months, if not years. So whether it is now a credible offer, I mean, I personally am always in favor of negotiation, talk as much as you can. So I would say, okay, take him up at his word, and let him send an emissary to Moscow, and with substantive belief, and also to ensure that the Atlantic powers back it up, because clearly what we've had so far is that Macron, who has been saying for a long time that we cannot build a European security order against Russia, it only can be with Russia, but yet he is not able to deliver either because of the framework and bloc discipline within the Atlantic power system. So but Zelensky simply needed to have said this a week ago. This is what is so astonishing. Instead of which, he went to the Munich Security Conference and threatened to become a nuclear power. It could not be more absurd. You had the Western powers saying that that the freedom of choice of any sovereign powers to join any alliance that they want, which is, of course, a fundamental absurdity. Imagine Cuba saying that and trying to become a nuclear power, or Republic of Ireland next to Britain, if they declare that they wish to join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and that the Chinese are welcome to pop some missiles into Ireland, that wouldn't last 5 minutes. So it was just fundamentally absurd. And yet he's now saying now, with his back to the wall, and of course, I mean, again, one doesn't necessarily approve of it, but this sort of coercive diplomacy of the mobilization of the armies around Ukraine for the last few months was all an attempt to open up negotiation. It was an attempt to achieve precisely what Zelensky is now offering. So I wonder how credible it is. I mean, certainly, perhaps it should be explored. Sure, send an emissary, send concrete proposal. I think obviously to avoid bloodshed and to avoid conflict is always important.
Stepping back, you have written often about the lost chance for peace at the end of the Cold War when the Soviet Union collapsed. If a new security architecture uniting all of Europe, including Russia, had been established at that time, the world would obviously be a very, very different place today. What happened?
Yeah, it's, there'll be two parts to this answer. Very briefly, though, at the end of the Cold War, there were two peace orders on offer, both reasonably good in some ways. The first one was the Gorbachevian version, let's call it, the one which is based on Charter internationalism, the Charter of the United Nations and subsequent international body of law built on that, and Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But the model there is sovereign internationalism, which is good. This is the one that Russia and China pursue. The second model is the hegemonic peace with the expansive liberal, so-called liberal international order, with two legs, the economic one and the peculiar model of the economy, and of course with NATO. You may say that they deliver certain public goods, but it would mean that the rest of the world has to be a subaltern, a subordinate, in some way or other accepting the dominance of this Atlantic power system. So these two models were developed. They've been in conflict, and ultimately this underlies the conflict to this day. Then more specifically, of course, we had this NATO enlargement question. And obviously we had all the promises in 1990 that it wouldn't enlarge. But even Zbigniew Brzezinski, in his famous book, The Grand Chessboard, a very intelligent book in strange sort of way, but really profoundly disturbing because it sees not nations and peoples as living subjects, but only as pieces on a chessboard, which is a really frightening image. But even Brzezinski, who was a passionate, he was obviously Jimmy Carter's national security advisor in the late 1970s. Even Brzezinski, who was ferociously in favor of NATO enlargement, said, it should only be done within the framework of an overarching architecture of some sort of agreement with Russia. So even he understood that unmediated NATO enlargement would lead to a catastrophe of the sort that we now see. So that's why we lost the peace. I mean, there's lots of other factors, but the two models of world peace, one on sovereign internationalism, sovereign development, one has to say, of countries coming together, building and using the huge opportunities of technology and of science and human talent, and the other one, which is a much more dependent sort of capitalism, more exploitative. And of course, the end of the Cold War took place just in a rising wave of neoliberalism, outsourcing, and all the other pathologies of our time.
At that time, Lyndon and Helga LaRouche called for more than a new security architecture for Europe, but rather called for bringing all of the Eurasian continent together through a series of development corridors connecting the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans by rail, a new Silk Road. Russia at the time was being looted by Western carpetbaggers and could not accept, but the Chinese welcomed the idea and co-sponsored with the Schiller Institute a conference in 1996 in Beijing on the new Silk Road, which Helga LaRouche addressed in a keynote. What is your reading on the impact of this new Silk Road, what's now called the Belt and Road Initiative since Xi Jinping officially adopted the Belt and Road in 2013? What do you see the impact of that development on the continent as a whole?
The Belt and Road Initiative and its maritime equivalent, I think, it's extraordinarily important because it provides an alternative source of development financing for all those countries who sign up to it. And it's criticized much in the West as becoming exploitative. It's becoming as a sort of debt. How can I put it? Debt trap.
Yeah.
Yes, to get their countries subordinate. Many good studies have demonstrated that this isn't quite the case. Clearly, there have been some issues, but what this has offered is genuine attempts. For example, I'll give one example, which of Kenya, which signed up to it. We, as have studied and looked at Kenya since I was a boy, and it was interesting that for many, many years there were plans to build this new railway line from Nairobi to Mombasa on the coast, and endless plans, endless funds, and they all disappeared, and the railway never happened. The Chinese came in as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, and pretty quickly they built it. There's issues. I think that they should use more local sourcing of infrastructure, of steel and of talent and so on, but at least they come in as a sort of a closed bubble, turnkey, with their own cooks, their own security guards and everything. Nevertheless, this railway, splendid railway, has been built. The Kenyans occasionally complain that they stocked it with rolling stock from old secondhand rolling stock from one of their cities, but still it was far better than anything they'd had before. So it's all development is always complex, and it always has to be balanced with local concerns and so on. Yet the Belt and Road Initiative is a project for the 21st century, and it's quite I'm someone who believes that infrastructure is important, that it isn't just as consumption, but to build and to use the technology, and as I say, as human skills to open up. And it isn't just infrastructure. I mean, this Mombasa Railway, for example, it does open up markets and it does open up facilities, and it can be transformative if you have the infrastructure balanced together with the social capital or even forms of social organization that are cooperative. You could call it socialism, you could call it other things, but ways in which we have not an exploitative form of development, but a genuinely where the profits and the work, the dignity of labor, as we used to call it, can manifest itself in combination with its infrastructure. So, but of course, we've seen this huge backlash against the Belt and Road Initiative. The Atlantic powers, Lithuania, for example, is now left, and there's a whole stack of attack on it because it is a model, an alternative model, not just of world power, but an alternative model of world development.
Which has certainly been lacking in the colonial world and the post-colonial world for many, many decades.
Yes.
Extending that idea even further, in 2007, there was a conference in Moscow, which was titled Mega Projects of Russia's East, a Transcontinental Eurasia-America Transport Link via the Bering Strait. A paper by Lyndon LaRouche was presented there called The World's Political Map Changes. Mendeleev would have agreed. And this promoted the idea of a tunnel under the Bering Strait. At the time, there was significant optimism that this was going to take place, that it would be constructed and would thereby physically connect the US and Russia by rail. What do you think such a great project would have meant for the world and for the US-Russia relations then, and what would it mean to try to revive that today?
As I say, I'm actually very keen on infrastructure development, railways, and less on highways, but that's also important as part of it. As for this one across the Bering Straits, I'm not sure that it would become, I mean, it's a fascinating idea. And what I do think, and this is what Russia's certainly now talking about, and Sergei Karaganov and many more, is that, and of course, given the fact that Russia is going to be hit with such sanctions, is that it will have to focus on the development of Siberia and the Russian Far East. I don't think that the Russia-US, I mean, you're right. In some ways, this physical link would then have been a symbolic development, but sometimes it would, if it cost billions, I think that would have been better spent, because Russia, of course, in the Soviet Union, spent their billions on developing Ukraine. And what did that help? They should have been spending it on developing the Urals, Siberia, and the Russian Far East. And of course, we now know the equivalent of this is that there's regular trains from Xi'an in China all the way to Hamburg in Germany. And so what we failed to achieve in that visionary idea of Lyndon LaRouche of going from US, Russia, it has been now built between China and Russia, that physical link. And of course, that's going to be the other one of these is the Northern Sea route as the ice and the seasons become longer and with these nuclear powered icebreakers. So that maritime link will perhaps serve as a functional substitute.
LaRouche always identified the British Empire as basically a tool of the City of London, the banking center. And that in that sense, the empire still very much exists, and together with Wall Street is dragging the entire Western world into a monetary and financial crisis, a hyperinflation, which could well mean the end of the empire and even the House of Windsor. As a British subject, how do you see the role of the British in the world today?
Well, I'm deeply critical of this global Britain agenda in the way that it is now developed, which reflects the worst aspects of to what you've just referred. That global Britain is an archaic project to try to re-establish influence, not in the framework of what we talked about just now, of peace and development. It's an old-fashioned gunboat diplomacy type attitude, which, of course, has had these enormous deleterious consequences over the years. And when Britain left the European Union, I wanted, and I would love to see, a global Britain that builds on the sort of ideas we've been talking about, which is the idea of development, of moving beyond militarism, moving beyond this endless attempt of gunboat diplomacy. And gunboat diplomacy of the sort we saw in the Black Sea when that British ship went past within the territorial waters of Crimea. And of course, the aircraft carrier has been sent off to the Far East, to the South China Sea, to wave the flag, which has been, I mean, this is a sort of 19th century behavior. So this is a worse sort of old-fashioned 19th century imperialism combined now with 21st century, new, well, how can I put it, the liberal empire of capital, which is exceptionally frightening in all sorts of ways. And it's also, one has to say, the media in all of this, the way that media autonomy has become undermined by not only financial interests, but those who, by the erosion of public debate.
Integrity initiative.
Yes, which is an excellent example of that, which is basically an instrument to intimidate and to destroy, undermine alternative perspectives.
Yes, right. So you have long called on Russia and China to put forward a positive perspective through their relationship regarding the purpose and the importance of their cooperation for the rest of the world. And they have done so with the February 4th joint statement called the Joint Statement of the Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China on the international relations, entering a new era and the global sustainable development. This was issued on the opening ceremony day for the Winter Olympics. Did this statement meet your expectations?
It did. I thought it was a splendid statement because it put to rest the argument that Russia and China are revisionist powers. Revisionist. This isn't a usual term of abuse, but what it has done, in fact, it was confirming many of my argument about these two models of world order at the end of the Cold War, because what this did was absolutely unequivocally commit the two countries to that body of international law, including human rights, as outlined in the United Nations Charter of 1945 and the Universal Declaration and all the rest. They went on and on about this in that document, including more positive perspectives about democracy, that each society has to shape its own destiny and there can be no single model imposed from outside, and which is, of course, the view of liberal hegemony after the end of the Cold War. So yes, it did. And more than that, it wasn't just the individual statements, but the fact that they two did it together was quite astonishing. And of course, it's now followed up. We've seen that with various comments by the Chinese foreign minister, Wang Yi, and others, which have reinforced the principles enunciated in the 4th of February joint statement.
We've discussed the failure of the Western powers, NATO, US, to respond to Russia's demand for a new security architecture for Europe. It's clear that this has brought us to the brink of a war, not just a war in Ukraine, but a war between the superpowers, a war that could very well be nuclear. You have called for a Helsinki II to use the model of the OSCE, the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, which includes Russia, to bring all the parties together for a mutually advantageous resolution to this very severe crisis. What is your expectation about the potential for such a conference?
There is undoubtedly a need for this. It's absolutely clear, but it has to be well prepared. And so therefore the foundations and the postulates have to be worked out. I mean, the conference, what would be on the agenda? You'd have a whole stack of things. First of all, let's put Ukraine and its status, and also those frozen conflicts, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, possibly even Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, but certainly the Donbass and Transnistria. But more broadly, there's such a conference. I have a feeling, it could take many formats. Yes, I think Helsinki would be an ideal way because it would then avoid the taint of Yalta, even though Yalta, the substance of the Yalta agreements in 1945, were actually useful and good. Not that, some of them obviously were not fulfilled, but the general principle agreement on the United Nations was important because what Yalta did was established a Security Council in the nascent United Nations. And this Security Council, the 5 permanent members, is a type of concert of powers. So if we are going to talk about a type of conference, it's useful to think back of other ones. And so a Congress of Vienna, possibly, which was the victorious powers at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. But one way or another, the issue is that to establish a framework in which all, or the great powers certainly, other powers as well, to buy into it, can establish the rules of the game. I'm deeply pessimistic. I don't think this is going to happen. And therefore, I have a feeling that the conflict will only intensify. I mean, I know that you've spoken about a new Treaty of Westphalia. The thing about Westphalia, which in some ways I would endorse, because what Westphalia did was enunciate for the first time that principle of sovereign internationalism, well, sovereignty, and then of sovereignty, which is fundamental. So states then can devise models for their own development and so on. But why I'd be slightly hesitant about Westphalia is because the other side of sovereignty, in my view, is to find ways of working together. So, sovereign internationalism, which goes beyond, and that's why I really do like the Charter International System, because 1945 emphasizes the UN Charter sovereignty, absolutely, but it also provides a framework for internationalism, for genuine internationalism of the sort that Russia and China are beginning to devise today. So, but I'm not sure, because one final point on all of this is that Putin, for the last 18 months, perhaps 2 years now, has been calling for a summit of the P5, the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council. That may have been an important first step. As you would expect, of course, there was the pandemic, one thing, but it could have taken place virtually. And of course, as always, it was rejected, as all of Russia's proposals over the last 2, if not more, decades have been rejected.
One of the reasons that Helga Zepp-LaRouche has emphasized the Treaty of Westphalia approach is that it's global rather than Europe or even Eurasia. And if you consider the fact that it is really the entire world is now faced with the general breakdown of the dollar-based international financial system, a hyperinflation that now everybody is aware of, and most of the financial institutions admit they have no idea how to stop it. It could get much worse. And also, of course, the pandemic, which is not under control by any means, as the head of Tedros, the other day said, 83% of the African population has not even had their first dose of vaccine. And now the danger of a nuclear war, which of course would affect the entire world. So that in order to truly resolve all of these things, you simply have to have all the major powers, but really the whole world represented in a single body. And the issue of this extreme crisis is obviously frightening, but at the same time, it forces people to reflect on the fact that they've had false assumptions about the future of mankind and the future of peace. And therefore, it becomes, while dangerous, also a moment of opportunity to bring about that kind of event that most, if you're following in a linear way the course of history, you might think is impossible. What do you think about that?
Yes, I think that a transformative agenda, which could be implemented through such a gathering, is fundamental. That But the shocking thing is that at the beginning of the pandemic, the feeling was all of humanity faces this enormous challenge. And the resolution can only be on a universal basis. That is, no one is safe until everyone is safe. When all of Africa, Asia is vaccinated, and more broadly, when its healthcare and developmental needs are addressed. So all of that is absolutely right. But the problem now is where is the societal push for this? Because it's not going to be granted from above, and especially with the sort of leadership which is on evidence in most Western powers. So and some people who've been working very closely, for example, for the peace movement for so many years, trying to say, look, we've got to halt the militarism of NATO, etc. And they've not got very far. And so I'm deeply pessimistic, though that does not take away the need. And therefore, our task, it seems to me always, is to formulate the agenda. And that's the best we can do. And well, formulate the agenda and provide adequate analysis. And that's what certainly I'm trying to do. And I know that you are as well.
Yeah, and on that question of how to bring that about, one of the things that Helga Zepp-LaRouche has emphasized is that the situation in Afghanistan, which is an abomination, after 20 years, 40 years really of warfare and destruction by the outside powers, then pulling out and leaving this place to starvation in a situation in which there's no food, there's no money. And the US even has gone so far as to steal the $7 billion of the central bank's money that they were holding in the Federal Reserve, which they're now openly declaring they're taking away from the central bank. But Helga insists that this is a situation which could and should bring the world together, because obviously everybody would agree that we don't want Afghanistan to be a center for terrorism, a center for drug production, and so forth, that it would behoove the entire world to address this humanitarian nightmare, beginning with modern healthcare and immediately providing the basis for the development of Afghanistan to be what it once was, a prosperous hub for east-west and north-south trade. So she's called this Operation Ibn Sina, named after this brilliant medical expert and philosopher from the 11th century from that region. So this is something I know you've been involved with the Stop the War movement. You appeared at a recent Stop the War event with Jeremy Corbyn, who, as I understand it, formed Stop the War after the 9/11 terrorist attack, but with the purpose of preventing a war on Afghanistan and subsequent wars after that. And obviously now, as I believe you or one of your associates said, every one of these efforts to stop these wars was ridiculed, but it's now been fully justified that we were right and the warmongers were wrong with the disasters that unfolded. What do we have to do to awaken the world's consciousness on this?
You're absolutely right. The Stop the War Coalition and other peace movements have been absolutely right, and their critique of the hawks whose only solution to most questions is to bomb it and to zap it and to invade it and to occupy it, and it's catastrophic, the fact that this sort of tendency has been unleashed in the 21st century. So, but when you say, well, how can we work to stop it? It's, I mean, the Gramscian vision, of optimism of the will and pessimism of the spirit, I suppose, is the only way forwards, because I think the world is regressing. It's going backwards massively. That we're seeing public services eroded, the quality of governance is going down. It's going down in Australia, it's going down in Britain massively. I've got a folder called Governance, and it's just shocking to see the undermining of local government, the quality of municipal government, the quality of democracy, even the outsourcing of services has meant poor services, but the profits raked off to multinationals, often even abroad in the UK context, to nationalized industries, Deutsche Bahn, Russian, German railways, and so on. So how do we move on in all of this? I don't know, but except each person must maintain their integrity and to warn of all of this. So this, even in this Ukrainian war, it's very easy. People are now condemning me, but I've absolutely nothing to be ashamed of. We have been working, and I've been working for years, if not decades, to avoid precisely this conflict, which has now engulfed us. That is what has been driving me for a long time, and it's failed. We're failed. And so I failed in stopping this. So you catch us, and we're talking at a time when I think the world is looking as dark as it has ever been.
You once compared the Versailles Treaty after World War I to the current argument by the Anglo-American NATO crowd of what they like to call the rules-based order, which, as we now know, is quite distinct from the actual international law from the UN Charter. Can you explain what you meant about the Versailles Treaty and the rules-based order?
Yeah, it's, there's two things. The Versailles Peace, of course, was a victor's peace against Germany. And it's interesting, in the Congress of Vienna, 1814, 1815, one of its great acts of statesmanship was to ensure that France became, even though defeated power, became part of that winning coalition. And thus, France was very quickly rehabilitated, whereas, and it worked, and basically, the Vienna Peace lasted until nearly a century, until the First World War. Obviously, there were Crimean War and other things in between. But the Versailles Peace lasted barely 20 years because Germany was humiliated and excluded from that peace. And why this Versailles analogy works for post-communist time is because Russia was also excluded. And this is where this war going on now. It took 20 years for Germany, and I'm not making the analogy that it's similar or the same, but I'm just saying in systemic terms, we're talking about a power which was dissatisfied for a long time. And Russia is quite clearly dissatisfied, though it is not, and this is where we have to get the judgment right. It's not out to grab land or anything like this. It's out for security. So the Versailles Peace was a disaster in all sorts of ways. As E.H. Carr describes in his marvelous book, The 20 Years Crisis, it was accompanied by massive idealism. And this takes us to this so-called liberal international order, the rules-based order. That idealism in the interwar years masked, of course, far more naked imperial and other great power achievements. Today, this so-called rules-based order, after 1989, after the end of the Cold War, and indeed after the Soviet collapse and Russian weakness, effectively substitutes for that Charter international system. It claims to be, in fact, the basic system of international order, the US-led international order. And so this is a massive act of usurpation, if you like, which both Russia and China, and indeed India and some other countries, are refusing to accept. So, and that is, if you like, that deep underlying, that fourth level, that deep underlying conflict between normative visions of world order, one based on the Charter international system, and the second one, the sort of usurpers, the usurped peace, which has ended as no peace at all, which was effectively the Versailles Peace, as far as Russia is concerned. And so today, the challenge is to ensure that the United States and its allies go back to the United Nations. And that's why Putin, when he called for a summit of UN, of the Permanent Five, was actually quite a smart move. And the joint declaration of Russia and China also stress this point, to stop the usurpation, and to a group of Western powers who claim to be synonymous with world order, rather than just being part of and subordinate to the rules of the United Nations and sovereign internationalism.
The so-called end of history.
Well, indeed, one of the most hubristic concepts ever. And the worst thing about it was, of course, is that it inverted, it was based on Hegelian dialectics. And, at one moment they abandoned Marxist dialectics, and they replaced it with this new form of Hegelian dialectics, the liberal one, that this is the end of history and it's the solution to all of humanity's needs.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Do you have any other thoughts you'd like to bring up for the audience that we have at Schiller and EIR?
Well, I just say it's been a pleasure talking with you. But as I stress, I do read the materials. I've been particularly close to our Australian colleagues, but also your intelligence review and so on. So all I can say is that I think that the vision which Schiller Institute and you have of combining technocracy to human need, and to harness human ingenuity through major projects, and we're talking about ways in which to make life better for all, I think is a visionary agenda, and indeed based on peace and cooperation. And I just wish you success, and I wish that more people would join us and work for that.
Yes, I certainly join you absolutely in that call, and certainly invite you to participate with us in our subsequent conferences as we try to pull the world together around a sane approach to the dignity of man.
Thank you.
Thank you.